Okay, so I know lots of you out there have already seen Sophie, A Murder in West Cork on Netflix. And like me, you were probably hooked too.
Okay.
But what we're doing today is um, going beyond the documentary itself, going past just the whodunit part.
Yeah.
Because this case, it's like, it has all these ripple effects. It spreads out and touches on so much more, right? We're talking about the media frenzy around it,
Yeah.
international legal battles, even like the image of Ireland itself.
You know, it's funny you should mention that because what I find so interesting about this case is how it plays with perceptions. You have this incredibly idyllic setting, rural Ireland, rugged beauty.
Yeah.
It's the kind of place that just screams like peaceful escape.
Mm.
And then, bam, you have this incredibly brutal crime that completely shatters that whole image.
It really is jarring, isn't it? I mean, it's almost like the setting itself becomes like another character in the story,
Yeah.
Like you're expecting one thing, peace, tranquility, and then you're hit with this darkness.
Total dark.
For sure.
Yeah.
So for those who haven't seen the documentary or just need a quick recap, can you remind us, who was Sophie Toscan du Plantier, and what was she even doing in West Cork?
Okay, so Sophie, she was a French film producer.
Okay.
Married to this big name in the industry, Daniel Toscan du Plantier.
Oh, right?
Yeah. And, she was making a name for herself. I mean, she was really starting to do interesting things, especially with documentaries. And West Cork, well, that was her escape. It's like her sanctuary, She bought a holiday home near Shoal in the early 90s.
Okay.
Because she was drawn to that tranquil, remote atmosphere.
And it's that same remoteness that makes the crime, I don't know, even more chilling, right? Like, it wasn't just that she was murdered, it was the brutality of it all. So, what were the initial challenges that the Gardaí, the Irish police, faced when they arrived at the scene?
So imagine this, okay. A crime scene in 1996, completely isolated in rural Ireland.
Yeah.
And forensic technology, I mean, it wasn't what it is today.
Not even close.
No. So securing the scene, gathering evidence, it was all made way more difficult by the location.
Right.
And then, of course, there's a question of motive, which was, completely unclear at the start.
Oh, so you've got this brutal crime, secluded location, and no clear motive.
Right.
I mean, that sounds like the perfect recipe for a media storm.
Oh, absolutely. And a storm it was.
Yeah.
I mean, the story of this French woman, this outsider, murdered in this seemingly peaceful Irish village, it gripped the press on both sides. In Ireland and France. And that's where Ian Bailey enters the picture.
Right, Ian Bailey, he was a British journalist living in West Cork at the time, and he actually covered the murder for the newspapers he worked for.
He did, yeah.
I mean, that in itself sounds like something out of a movie.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And it fed right into that whole media frenzy. But let's unpack why he actually became the prime suspect. Because it wasn't just his profession, there was this buildup of circumstantial evidence against him.
Okay, so no smoking gun, so to speak.
Right.
But what were the actual pieces of the puzzle that pointed to Bailey?
Well, there were witness accounts that put him near Sophie's house around the time of the murder.
Okay.
And some people reported seeing scratches on his arms and face in the days following. Scratches that he kind of struggled to explain convincingly,
Yeah.
But it's important to remember at this point, it's all still circumstantial.
So even with this circumstantial evidence, what made the Irish authorities, hesitate to charge Bailey?
Right.
It sounds like the media had already made up their minds.
Well, you're hitting on a key point here, which is the difference between public opinion and what you can actually prove in court. I mean, there was no forensic link to Bailey.
Really?
Nope. No DNA, no fingerprints. And then there were inconsistencies in the witness statements, and that raised doubts for the Gardaí.
Oh, I see.
They operate under a different standard than the court of public opinion.
But the public wasn't the only one pushing for answers, right? Like Sophie's family in France, they were also demanding justice.
Of course.
So how did that lead to, this unusual situation of the French trial?
Well, Sophie was a French citizen, so their authorities had a vested interest in the case.
Right.
But what's really extraordinary is that they went ahead with a trial in absentia.
Wow.
Meaning Bailey wasn't even present.
Oh, wow.
And they used a lot of the same evidence that the Irish deemed insufficient, ultimately convicting him and sentencing him to 25 years.
Convicted in absentia, that's not something you hear about every day. It sounds almost like there were these two separate realities, two different legal systems trying to grapple with the same crime.
Exactly. And that clash clash, that's really what highlights the complexities of this case.
Mm.
Because Bailey maintains his innocence, refused to participate in the French proceedings, and the Irish courts ultimately blocked the extradition request from France.
So it just becomes
It's a tug of war, yeah.
this legal labyrinth, and Sophie's family are just caught in the middle.
Exactly.
It's really tragic. I mean, it makes you wonder, what even is justice in a case like this? When two legal systems arrive at such completely different conclusions.
That's a good question.
But before we get lost in the legal weeds here, was Bailey like the only person considered a suspect?
He was the primary focus, for sure.
Okay.
But other theories did emerge. They just didn't really get the same level of attention.
Right.
Remember, this case captivated people, so there were always whispers of, alternative motives and other potential suspects.
Okay, spill the tea. What were some of the other theories floating around?
So some speculation pointed to Sophie's husband, Daniel.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There were whispers about his business dealings, his personal life. Another theory that popped up focused on a local man with a history of violence, particularly towards women.
So it sounds like names were thrown around, but nothing concrete enough to derail the focus on Bailey.
Right.
Okay.
These alternative theories, while they definitely added to the intrigue, they never really gained any substantial traction. And that's because, again, they lacked credible evidence. It's that constant push and pull,
Okay.
the desire for answers, battling against the limitations of what can actually be proven.
We've covered a lot of ground already, laying out the foundation of this case, the setting, the victim, the prime suspect, the legal battles. But what's really sticking with me is how this crime took on a life of its own.
Yeah.
And became this tangled web of perception versus reality.
It's true. And that's what makes this case so compelling, even after all these years. Because it raises questions about how we form our own opinions,
Yeah.
how media narratives influence us, and the challenges of actually achieving true justice when so much just remains shrouded in uncertainty. But before we dive into all of that, what's jumped out at you so far? What's piqued your interest?
It's crazy, right? Like, as we go deeper into this whole thing, it's clear that the Sophie Toscan du Plantier murder is about way more than just a single crime.
It is, yeah.
We've talked about the setting, the investigation, all that.
Yeah.
But there's this cultural clash that feels, I don't know, almost like it's woven into the fabric of the story.
It's true. It's like the case, it exposes this underlying tension, right? This collision between different worlds. You have Sophie, she's this Parisian filmmaker, sophisticated, and she's seeking refuge in rural Ireland.
Right.
And this idyllic image, it clashes so dramatically with the brutality of her murder.
And that clash, it didn't just play out at the crime scene.
Right.
Like, it spilled over into the media frenzy that surrounded the whole case.
Yeah.
So how did the portrayal of Sophie, this outsider, and the image of Ireland itself, how did that get caught up in the reporting?
Well, you have to think about the headlines at the time, right? You had this French woman murdered in this small Irish village.
Right.
And it just played into all these existing stereotypes.
Yeah.
Painting this picture of a peaceful haven turned sinister.
Yeah.
And for the press, it was irresistible.
So you're saying that the image of Ireland, the land of 1,000 welcomes, as the saying goes,
right,
took a bit of a hit.
Well, the case definitely challenged that romanticized view, because it brought to light this darker side, this capacity for violence that just totally contradicted the idyllic image. And unfortunately, Ian Bailey, with his outsider status, his, unconventional lifestyle,
right,
he became a focal point for those anxieties.
Because he didn't quite fit the mold, right?
Exactly.
He was different, eccentric, and the media, as we've seen, they love a good narrative.
They do.
So how did that play into their coverage of Bailey as a suspect?
Well, remember, this was before social media, dominated the news cycle. People relied heavily on newspapers and television for information. And early reports, they often highlighted Bailey's eccentricities, his interest in the occult, his sometimes abrasive personality.
Right.
And they presented all these details, often without much context, And it shaped a perception of him that many people found unsettling.
It almost sounds like they were creating a character,
Right.
like a villain for the story before all the facts were even in.
It's true.
So do you think that that intense focus on Bailey as the prime suspect, do you think that may have hindered the investigation in any way?
It's a complex issue. It's hard to say for sure.
Yeah.
But it's certainly possible that this relentless media focus, which often bordered on, like, a trial by media, it may have influenced how the public viewed Bailey, perhaps even before all the evidence was considered.
And if the public is, like, convinced of someone's guilt,
Right.
it can be hard for them to see anything else, right?
It is, yeah.
It's like that tunnel vision sets in.
Exactly. And that tunnel vision, whether conscious or not, it could potentially affect witnesses, investigators, even jurors down the line.
Wow.
It really highlights the importance of approaching these cases with an open mind.
Yeah.
Recognizing that media narratives, while they can be compelling, don't always reflect the full truth.
It's a good reminder to always be skeptical, to question what we're presented with,
Sure.
especially when it comes to high-profile cases like this one. Okay, so we've got the cultural clash, the media frenzy, and then there's this whole legal roller coaster this case became.
Right.
Conviction in France, extradition battles, appeals.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through, like, the legal complexities of it all?
This is where the case takes a truly unusual turn.
Okay.
Remember, Bailey was never charged in Ireland, right?
Oh, great.
The Gardaí, despite their suspicions, they didn't feel they had enough solid evidence to secure a conviction in an Irish court.
And yet he was convicted in France.
He was.
How is that even possible?
Well, the French legal system, it allows for trials in absentia, which is something that's very rare in common law systems like Ireland's. And in this case, they relied heavily on witness statements, some of which were deemed unreliable by the Irish courts.
Oh, wow.
And remember, Bailey wasn't there to defend himself.
So essentially, he was convicted without having the chance to even present his side of the story in a French court.
That's right.
And then when France tried to extradite him, what happened?
Well, the Irish courts, they had to consider whether the French trial met their standards of fairness and due process.
Right.
And ultimately, they blocked the extradition requests multiple times.
Wow.
There were concerns about the evidence used, the potential for a miscarriage of justice, and the fact that Bailey had already been tried in absentia.
Talk about a legal labyrinth.
It is.
It's like two different legal systems speaking different languages.
It is.
Each with its own definition of justice.
Right.
It makes you realize how complicated things can get when a crime crosses international borders.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It highlights the challenges of jurisdiction, the differences in legal traditions, and the difficulty of, actually achieving a sense of resolution when two countries have such divergent outcomes. And all of this is playing out against the backdrop of Sophie's family's desperate search for answers and closure.
Which brings us to another, crucial aspect of this whole story.
Yeah.
The impact on Sophie's family and the community of West Cork. How did this case, with all its twists and turns, how did it affect them?
So imagine losing a loved one in such a brutal and shocking way,
Yeah.
and then having to navigate this legal maze for years, even decades.
That's heartbreaking.
It is. The Toscan du Plantier family, they've shown incredible resilience, a determination to find justice for Sophie that's truly remarkable.
That must be incredibly frustrating for them,
Yeah.
having this wound that never seems to heal.
Oh, absolutely.
And what about West Cork itself?
Yeah.
This crime, it shattered the peace of a community that prided itself on its tranquility.
Absolutely. I mean, this wasn't just a story in the news. This was their reality.
Yeah.
The investigation, the media scrutiny, the constant speculation and rumors, it all took a toll. It created divisions, fueled suspicions, and cast a shadow over this once peaceful haven.
It's like this case became a part of their lives,
Yeah.
a weight they had to carry, whether they wanted to or not.
Right.
It's heavy.
It is. And it reminds us that these crimes, while they might capture our attention from afar, they have very real, very lasting impacts on the people who live in these places, The people who have to grapple with the consequences long after the cameras have moved on.
So we've talked about the cultural clash, the media frenzy,
Yeah.
the legal battles, and the impact on the community.
Right.
But there's one piece of the puzzle we haven't really explored in depth.
Yeah.
The alternative theories.
Yeah.
You mentioned them earlier, those whispers of other motives, other potential suspects.
Yes, the alternative suspects.
Yeah.
They're like the threads that lead you down different paths, tempting you with the possibility of a different outcome, a different answer to the question of who killed Sophie.
And I have to admit, I'm a little curious myself.
Yeah.
Is there any substance to these alternative theories?
Right.
Or are they just distractions from the main narrative?
Oh, it's so tempting, isn't it?
It is.
To go down those side roads, explore those what ifs that might lead to a different culprit altogether.
Hmm.
Because with a case like this, I mean, the answer remains so elusive, right? That
Yeah.
there's just this natural desire to find something, anything that brings, even a little sense of resolution.
Okay, so let's indulge that curiosity for a bit.
Right.
What are some of the more prominent alternative theories that have been, proposed over the years?
Well, as we mentioned earlier, one theory points to Sophie's husband, Daniel Toscan du Plantier.
Right.
And there's always speculation in cases like this about spouses.
Oh, for sure.
And with Daniel, there were, whispers about his business dealings, his personal life, things that could, potentially suggest a motive.
It's like that classic Agatha Christie trope, isn't it?
Totally.
Like the husband is always a suspect.
Always.
But was there any actual evidence to support these suspicions about Daniel?
Not really. I mean, it was mainly speculation fueled by the fact that he was, this prominent figure,
Yeah.
and perhaps also by the desire to find an answer, any answer that seemed to fit.
So a classic red herring, maybe.
Maybe.
Okay. What about that other theory you mentioned?
Yeah.
The one about the local man with a history of violence.
Right, right. That one gained some traction because it seemed to tap into a different kind of fear, a more localized one.
Hmm.
There was this existing unease about a man in the area who had been known to be violent,
Yeah.
particularly towards women.
So you've got the high-profile husband on one hand
Right.
and a local threat on the other. It almost feels like the case became like a Rorschach test, with people seeing what they wanted to see based on their own, fears and biases.
That's a great way to put it. It really speaks to the challenge of separating fact from fiction in a case that's been, I mean, so heavily scrutinized, so intensely debated.
But even with these alternative theories swirling around, none of them really managed to displace the focus on Ian Bailey. Why do you think that is?
I think it comes back to that initial narrative,
Yeah.
that image of Bailey that was so powerfully constructed, in those early days.
Right.
The circumstantial evidence, his behavior, his profession, it all just seemed to fit a certain profile.
And once that image took hold, it was impossible to shake.
Right.
Even when, doubts about the evidence against him emerged.
Exactly. It's a reminder that in cases like this, perception can be just as powerful as hard evidence.
So we've explored the main suspect, the legal battles, the alternative theories, even the cultural context of this crime. But there's still this lingering question, right?
Yeah.
Will we ever know for sure who killed Sophie Toscan du Plantier?
It's the question that, that haunts this case, isn't it?
It does.
And honestly, I don't have a definitive answer.
Yeah.
There's always the possibility that new evidence could emerge, that, technology could provide breakthroughs we can't even imagine right now.
It's like that little sliver of hope that keeps people so fascinated by cold cases,
It is.
The idea that maybe someday the truth will finally come to light.
It's powerful.
Yeah. But even if that happens, even if the mystery is solved, there will still be scars left behind.
There will.
Sophie's family will still carry the weight of their loss. The community of West Cork will still bear the memory of that violence.
It doesn't just go away.
It's a sobering reminder that sometimes, even with answers, there's no real closure.
There isn't.
But even without those definitive answers, what can we learn from the Sophie Toscan du Plantier case?
What stays with you even after all this time?
I think for me, it's a case study in the power of perception. In how easily narratives can take hold and how challenging it can be to see past them,
Yeah.
It's a reminder to be critical consumers of information, to question assumptions, and to recognize that even in the search for justice, the truth can be incredibly elusive.
It's a lesson we can apply to so many aspects of our lives, isn't it?
It is.
Not just true crime, but the news we consume, the stories we tell ourselves, the way we view the world.
Absolutely. This Sophie Toscan du Plantier case, it's a tragedy, a mystery, and ultimately a cautionary tale about the limits of our knowledge and the enduring power of perception.
Well said. And on that note, we wrap up our deep dive into this complex and fascinating case. We hope you'll join us next time for another exploration of the world around us.